She was just a janitor, until she taught 9 languages to the son of a billionaire. Sounds impossible, doesn't it? But behind the grand marble walls of one of the most powerful families in the country, something happened. Something that no amount of money, therapy, or elite education could have predicted. A quiet revolution, born from silence. And it all started with a song. If you believe in stories that deserve to be heard, hit subscribe and feel what a single story can awaken. Now let me show you what really happened. Imagine a house so big, so polished, so perfectly designed, that even the echoes sound expensive. A mansion hidden in the hills of Connecticut, guarded by tall iron gates and layers of silence. A place where the staff speaks in whispers, and emotions are packed away like the china in the glass cabinets. Everything works, everything shines, but nothing breathes. The Montgomery estate wasn't just a home. It was a fortress made of wealth, routine, and grief. In one of its many endless corridors down past the 3rd drawing room and the private library lived a boy, Noah Montgomery. He was 10 years old, and he hadn't spoken a single word in over 3 years. Since the day he lost his mother, Noah had disappeared into himself. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. Psychologists tried, therapists failed. Specialists came and went, armed with plush toys and degrees from Harvard and Yale. Nothing worked. The boy remained silent, always watching, never speaking, like a ghost inside a living body. His father, Charles Montgomery, was a titan of industry. He built empires from numbers, but in his own house, he couldn't build a bridge to reach his own son, so he poured money into solutions. Private tutors, speech therapists, expensive interventions. They all walked through the front doors with confidence and left through the back with excuses. No one could reach Noah. At least no one they expected could. And then she arrived, early one Monday morning, wearing a faded coat and sneakers with torn soles. She carried a duffel bag over one shoulder and a quiet determination in her eyes. Her name was Grace Miller, the new janitor. The housekeeper barely introduced her. "Stick to your section, don't talk too much, and stay out of Mr. Montgomery's way." Grace nodded. She didn't come to talk. She came to work. They gave her the West Wing to clean, the part of the mansion no one really used anymore, which included a forgotten library and a child who had long ago stopped being noticed. She pushed her cleaning cart through the marble halls like a ghost with a purpose, polishing gold doorknobs, wiping away invisible dust from glass vases worth more than her old apartment. She moved like someone who had learned how to take up as little space as possible, and no one questioned her, because no one really saw her. But Grace saw everything. On her 3rd day, she found herself in the old library. It was her favorite room, not because of its size or the grand piano in the corner, but because it still smelled like paper and memories. It felt alive. She was dusting one of the high shelves when she began to hum, a soft Italian lullaby her grandmother used to sing to her before bed. She wasn't even aware she was doing it. It was just reflex, comfort. And in that moment, in that one unguarded, unremarkable second, something happened. A boy held his breath behind the bookshelf. He didn't move, didn't blink. He just listened. The voice was different, not like the voices of the professionals who came with agendas and exit strategies. This voice wasn't asking anything of him. It wasn't trying to fix him. It was just singing. The next morning, something even stranger happened. Grace was mopping the marble floor of the east hallway when she heard a whisper. Barely a sound, a single word, floating down from the grand staircase like a feather. "Luna." She looked up, and there he was, Noah, peeking from behind the railings, eyes wide and terrified, but present. She didn't speak. She didn't rush. She simply smiled and answered gently, in French, "Bonjour, Noah." He didn't run. He didn't cry. He smiled back. And in that simple exchange, one word offered, one word returned, a door opened, not just in the house, but inside a boy who everyone thought had locked himself away forever, and in a woman no one had bothered to know, because sometimes it takes the quietest person in the room to hear what no one else can. Grace Miller didn't arrive with credentials. She didn't arrive with confidence. She didn't even arrive with proper luggage. Just a worn-out backpack that hung tired from one shoulder, and shoes that had clearly walked farther than most people's patients ever would. The security guard at the service gate barely looked up when she signed her name. Another new hire, another face to forget. But if anyone, had looked a little closer, they might have seen something strange in her eyes. Not fear, not hope, just depth, like a calm lake where something heavy had sunk long ago and never floated back up. Grace walked into the Montgomery mansion like someone entering a museum where she didn't belong. She didn't pause to admire the chandeliers. She didn't marvel at the ivory statues or the walls lined with priceless art. She just moved, one careful step at a time, as if afraid to leave footprints where she wasn't wanted. The head housekeeper, a stiff woman named Mrs. Donnelly, led her through the halls without a smile. "Stick to your section, don't talk to the family, and whatever you do, stay out of the East Wing unless instructed." Grace nodded. Once. She didn't come to make conversation. She came to work, and that she did, silently, flawlessly. By the end of her first day, her assigned section gleamed. Floors polished to glass, windows spotless, silver shining like new. But no one said anything. No one noticed. That's the thing about invisible people. They're only seen when they stop doing their job. So Grace made sure she never gave anyone a reason to look her way. In the break room, the other staff didn't bother to introduce themselves. They talked around her, over her, never to her. She didn't take offense. She was used to it. In fact, she preferred it. Because the less people asked, the less she had to answer. And Grace had mastered the art of saying nothing about a life that once had everything. Every morning she arrived early, before the house woke up. Before the noise and the rhythm of wealth filled the air again, she would wipe down the breakfast room in silence, watching the sun climb through the tall windows, and for a few quiet minutes, she allowed herself to feel something like peace. But it never lasted, because she didn't come to feel. She came to disappear. There were pieces of her past she kept wrapped tightly in silence. A classroom, a little girl's laugh, a pair of hands she would never hold again. But no one in that house knew any of that. To them, she was the new janitor, a woman with no story, no importance, no reason to be noticed. What they didn't know was that she carried the kind of grief that teaches you to breathe quietly, to walk lightly, to make yourself small enough so the world doesn't crush you. Grace had stopped hoping anyone would see her. But deep down, beneath the routine, beneath the quiet, a single question still lived inside her. Is there still something in me worth giving? She didn't know it yet, but the answer to that question was waiting just around the corner behind a bookcase, in the form of a boy who had forgotten how to speak, and for the first time in years, Grace Miller was about to be needed again, not for her silence, but for everything she'd once believed had died inside her. Noah Montgomery was born into wealth so vast that he never knew what it meant to need anything, except one thing: connection. At 10 years old, Noah had lived in more luxury than most people would in a lifetime. His birthday parties were planned by event agencies that coordinated royal galas. His bedroom was bigger than most people's homes. His toys came from Europe. His tutors came from Stanford. But no one could reach him, because Noah hadn't spoken a word since he was 7. It happened suddenly. A car accident, a rainy night, a siren. His mother, Elizabeth, was gone before anyone could explain what had happened. And just like that, so was Noah's voice. Not just his ability to speak, but the will to. At first, the doctors called it selective mutism, then psychological trauma. Then they used longer, colder terms, the kind that fill expensive reports but leave hearts untouched. What they couldn't admit was simple. Noah wasn't broken. He was grieving. And no one was listening in the language he needed most. The therapists came with flashcards and soft voices, the specialists with clipboards and promises. They asked him questions he didn't want to answer, showed him games he didn't want to play, and every time he grew quieter, smaller, until even his father stopped trying. Charles Montgomery wasn't a cruel man, but he was a busy one, CEO of multiple companies, philanthropist, public speaker. He built orphanages in Kenya, but didn't know how to sit beside his own son in silence. He thought that love meant giving the best food, the best doctors, the best education. But what Noah needed wasn't on a resume. He needed someone who saw beyond the silence. He drifted through the mansion like a soft shadow, always barefoot, always quiet. He had a habit of sitting cross-legged in the same corner of the toy room, surrounded not by action figures or tablets, but by books, hundreds of them, Books in Arabic, Russian, Portuguese, French, picture dictionaries in Korean and Spanish, old storybooks with worn edges and stickers still on the covers. No one knew who had ordered them. Maybe his mother once had. Maybe Noah was just trying to find a language, any language, that would unlock the door he had shut inside himself. But day after day, week after week, no words came, only silence. Only those wide, searching eyes that seemed to carry an entire storm behind them. Until the day he heard that song, until he heard a voice that wasn't trying to fix him or label him or reach into him with gloves on. It was just music, soft, unplanned, human, and it was the first thing that made him feel something real since the day his world collapsed. He didn't speak that day, he didn't even breathe too loudly, but something inside him cracked, not like glass, but like a shell, and from that tiny crack, light started to find its way in. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her story, but for the first time in 3 years, Noah Montgomery wanted to listen, not because he was told to, but because someone finally sounded like home. It didn't happen in a therapy room. There were no clipboards, no assessments, no carefully crafted exercises. It happened in the quiet corner of a library while Grace was polishing the glass panes of a tall window and humming softly to herself. She didn't even know she was singing. It was instinct, like an old reflex from a time she barely remembered. A lullaby in Italian, sweet slow from another lifetime. She had sung that melody to her daughter years ago, before the world burned. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't even loud. It was just memory wrapped in melody. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that just a few feet away, behind a tall bookshelf, Noah Montgomery was standing perfectly still. He didn't understand all the words, but something about the sound felt safe, like warm light slipping through a locked door. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of a voice. He was drawn to it. He came back the next morning. Grace was in the hallway, mopping quietly, when she heard it. A sound so faint it almost didn't exist. Luna. She stopped, turned slowly, and there he was, standing halfway up the grand staircase, one hand on the railing, eyes wide and unsure, but locked onto her. Grace didn't rush, didn't question. She smiled, and with a voice like sunlight, she replied softly, "Bonjour, Noah." He blinked. Then, the smallest thing, he smiled back. She didn't tell anyone what happened, didn't write it down, didn't even allow herself to celebrate, but something inside her stirred, a flutter of something long forgotten, hope. The next day, it happened again. She was wiping the shelves in the library when she heard footsteps behind her. This time, no hiding. Noah walked right in. He sat down on the thick carpet, opened a small blue picture book in Spanish, and pointed to a drawing of a cat. He didn't say a word. He just looked up at her, waiting. Grace knelt beside him, gently. "Gato," she said, then smiled and added, "Chat," in French. Noah repeated both, slowly, quietly, but he repeated them. That's how it started, not with a lesson, with an invitation, a moment of shared presence, a new language born not of grammar, but of trust. Every day after that, Noah began to show up, not with questions, not with demands, but with a book, a word, a look. And Grace answered him with quiet joy. She started slipping little words into the air while cleaning the floor, or dusting the lamp, or folding the throw blankets in the lounge. Window, fenetra, ventana, little seeds, scattered like breadcrumbs. And Noah. He followed, at first with eyes, then with smiles, then with sounds, until the words began to take root. One day he whispered it back, "Star." She nearly cried, but didn't. She just looked at him and said with a trembling voice, "Very good." They never made a plan. There were no structured lessons, no rules. Just a boy, a woman, and a growing rhythm that only they seemed to hear. She began to carry handwritten cards in her apron pocket, 1 or 2 each day. A new word, a drawing, a gesture. She would accidentally leave them near his usual path. He would pick them up like secret treasures. He never spoke in front of others. He never broke his silence at meals or with staff. But with Grace, he was learning how to speak again, not just in English, in French, Spanish, Italian, Arabic, Japanese, German, Portuguese, Russian, and in kindness, in laughter, in presence. The mansion remained quiet. No one knew what was unfolding in the forgotten corners of the library. But every day, for a few stolen minutes, something sacred happened. A boy who had forgotten how to speak was rediscovering his voice, and a woman who thought she had nothing left to give was giving the most important thing of all. Something unspoken was unfolding between them. It wasn't a lesson plan, it wasn't therapy. It was a language of their own, a quiet, hidden code made of glances, drawings, syllables, and trust. Grace didn't teach Noah the way others had tried to. She didn't ask him to repeat after her. She didn't demand eye contact or progress reports. She simply spoke and waited. Sometimes she'd leave a word beside his chair. Other times she'd whisper it gently while folding his sweater. And Noah, cautious, observant, the boy who once lived in silence, began to answer. Not always with words, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a finger tapping a picture, sometimes just with his eyes, widening in recognition, lighting up with joy. And then, slowly, the words began to come. Stella, Chat, Koshka, Avare. One by one, he reached for them. Not with his mouth at first, but with his memory. He would bring her books. Books no one had touched in years, written in languages neither of them were fluent in. But Grace would find a way. She would trace the letters with her finger, sound them out, pair them with gestures. And Noah, he absorbed it all like sunlight through stained glass. One day he came to her holding an old notebook. The pages were filled with scribbles, symbols, lines, some real words, some invented ones. He had begun creating his own dictionary, a private catalogue of what the world was finally starting to sound like again. Grace said nothing. She just sat beside him, turning the pages slowly, honoring every mark like it was sacred. She knew this wasn't just vocabulary. It was healing. Each word, each letter, was a piece of himself he was gathering back together. But it wasn't just Noah who was changing. With every new phrase he dared to speak, Grace felt something shift inside her too. She remembered things, chalkboards, lesson plans, classrooms filled with little voices, memories she had buried beneath pain. But now, with each word Noah spoke, those pieces began to resurface. Not like ghosts, but like seeds. Seeds she thought would never bloom again. She began preparing for him. Each morning before starting her shift, she would write a few new words on homemade flashcards, sometimes in French, sometimes German, sometimes Arabic, always with a little drawing beside it. She didn't give them all at once, just one or two per day, left like secret messages in the places only Noah would look. She never asked if he liked them, but she knew he did, because by the end of each day, every single card was gone, collected, kept, remembered. And Grace began to understand something no textbook had ever taught her. Language isn't just sound, it's feeling, it's memory, it's movement between hearts. Noah wasn't learning languages the way most children did. He was remembering the world through emotion. He would smile at soft vowels, frown at harsh consonants, giggle at rhythm. Sometimes he would combine phrases in 3 different languages, not because he was confused, but because that was how it made sense in his world. A world of color, and music, and meaning, and grace. She followed him into that world, not to lead, but to walk beside, because this was not about teaching anymore. It was about being present. And for a boy who had lived surrounded by wealth, but starved of connection, that presence was everything. Noah was speaking, to Grace, in many languages, and in one only they understood, a language of trust, of healing, of second chances. Everyone in the mansion thought they knew who Grace Miller was. The janitor, the quiet one, the woman who never spoke unless spoken to, who mopped the floors with care, cleaned the mirrors until they sparkled, and vanished by sundown. But no one ever asked where she came from. No one asked why her eyes seemed to be always searching for something just out of reach. Because in a house where silence was expected of the staff, Grace's silence was convenient. And she never volunteered her story, not because she was hiding, but because she had already lost the strength to tell it. Until one afternoon she let a piece of it slip. The book landed face up. A photograph inside fluttered out, black and white, a group of students mid-lecture. One woman stood at the center, holding a marker, smiling at a whiteboard filled with phonetic symbols. Noah picked it up, looked at it, then at her. Grace froze. Then quietly, she spoke. "That used to be me," she told him slowly, as if pulling words from a place long sealed shut. That she had once been a professor, not just any professor. Grace Miller had taught linguistics at Columbia University, specializing in childhood language acquisition. She had traveled the world presenting research. She had written articles, been published, respected, applauded. People used to take notes when she spoke. Now she carried rags in her pocket and wrote words on flashcards for a boy no one else believed in. Noah didn't understand everything she said, but he understood the feeling in her voice. It cracked as she spoke of her daughter. A car crash, a little girl lost, a husband gone soon after from grief too heavy to carry. In 1 year, she had buried her entire world. And when the world offered her pity and job offers, she couldn't accept either. She walked away from academia, from titles, from herself. She moved to a different city, changed her name on every record, but the one inside her heart. Took a job that didn't ask questions. She didn't clean floors because she lacked options. She cleaned because she couldn't bear the sound of her own voice in a classroom anymore, because every child's face reminded her of the one she'd never see again. And yet, here was Noah, sitting on the library carpet, looking at her the way her daughter used to, holding that photo like it mattered. He didn't say a word. He just reached out and touched her hand, not out of sympathy, but recognition. Because in his own way, he understood what it meant to lose your words. That night, Grace sat in her small room behind the kitchen, surrounded by the quiet hum of the dishwasher. She pulled out a folder from beneath her mattress, a folder no one had seen in years. Inside were faded diplomas, a letter from the university, an old ID card. She looked at it all, not with longing, but with peace. She didn't need a classroom anymore. She had one, right down the hallway, with a boy who had already taught her more about resilience than any academic ever had. In that moment, Grace realized something simple, something that had been buried beneath years of silence and sorrow. She hadn't lost her purpose, she had just misplaced it. And now, piece by piece, Noah was helping her find it again, not through accolades, but through whispers, smiles, and the sound of a single word spoken for the first time in years. It started with a whisper, then came a smile. Then, the floodgates opened. Little by little, Noah Montgomery, the boy who hadn't spoken in 3 years, began to build an entire world out of words. But not just in English. He spoke in French, softly at first, then with growing confidence. He answered questions in Spanish, sang verses in Italian, whispered riddles in German. He mimicked Grace's greetings in Arabic, pointed to things around the house in Portuguese, and even tried his hand at Japanese and Russian, giggling at how the words tickled his tongue. He wasn't just repeating sounds, he was playing with them, owning them, using language not to perform, but to connect. And with every new word, Grace saw something else growing alongside his vocabulary: confidence. Noah began to meet her at the library door each morning, already seated with his books open, his notebook ready, as if their secret sessions had become the most important part of his day. Sometimes he would prepare questions ahead of time, drawn, not written, like a sun with the word soul in 5 languages scrawled around it, or a cat labeled gato, chat, neko, koshka, and cat. He didn't care which one was correct. He wanted to know how they all felt. And Grace, she matched his energy. She no longer simply left cards in his path. Now she brought small whiteboards, picture dictionaries, vocabulary games made from cereal boxes. She no longer tiptoed down the halls. Now she hummed while walking, with a new rhythm in her step, not of sadness but of purpose. They started building a wall of words in the corner of the library. Sticky notes, flashcards, scraps of paper filled with letters and doodles. It was messy, unapproved, and absolutely beautiful. To anyone else it was chaos. To Noah and Grace it was architecture, the blueprint of something sacred, and yet no one else knew. The staff still saw a boy who kept to himself, a janitor who never spoke during lunch, a silent hallway, a silent boy. But inside that silence something extraordinary was growing. Noah had started creating sentences. He mixed languages like colors on a canvas, French structure with Arabic nouns, Spanish questions with English answers. He wasn't just remembering words, he was living through them. One afternoon, as Grace organized books, Noah sat beside her with his small red notebook. He wrote, slowly, then held it up. Me gusta aprender contigo. I like learning with you. She didn't speak. Her throat closed for a second, but she smiled and nodded. I like learning with you too. It wasn't about fluency, or grammar, or IQ. It was about something deeper. A soul returning to life. A child realizing he was not alone. A woman remembering she was still capable of lighting a spark. Every word Noah spoke something back into Grace, not only who she had been, but who she could still be. He reminded her of her daughter, not because he looked the same, but because of how he asked questions with his eyes, how he held words like they were fragile, sacred things. Grace understood, and that understanding became a bridge, built with verbs and vowels, across the deep chasm of loss. Noah began leaving notes for her too, folded papers tucked under books, slid inside drawers hidden under cushions. One day she opened one and found, "Thank you for hearing me," written in 5 different languages. Grace held it to her chest, closed her eyes, and knew she was no longer just helping a child speak, she was helping him feel seen. And that's a language no school teaches. The Montgomery mansion was built to keep the world out. Its walls were thick, its windows tall, its people quiet. And so for weeks the miracle happening inside the library stayed hidden, like a secret too fragile to be exposed. But secrets, even sacred ones, eventually find their way into the light. It happened on a Wednesday. Rain drizzled against the windows, soft and steady. Noah and Grace sat cross-legged on the floor of the library, surrounded by flashcards, open books, and a small whiteboard filled with words about food in 3 different languages. Noah was laughing, actually laughing, as he tried to pronounce croissant like a proper Frenchman, while Grace exaggerated the accent until he nearly fell over, giggling. That's when they heard it. The door creaked open. No footsteps, no voice, just presence. Grace turned slowly, and there, standing in the doorway, was Charles Montgomery. His suit was crisp, his tie perfect, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were stuck on the scene before him. His son, sitting on the floor, speaking, smiling. Noah froze. The whiteboard marker dropped from his hand. Grace stood, careful and composed, still holding a flashcard that read, "Apple," in English, French, and Arabic. Charles stepped forward, slowly. His voice came low, measured. "What's going on here?" Grace didn't flinch. She met his gaze, calm, unwavering. "We're learning together," she said. He frowned. "Since when does my son speak?" Silence. Noah looked down, afraid. Grace turned to him, kneeled beside him gently, and whispered something in German. Noah took a breath, lifted his head, and spoke. "Guten Tag, Papa." "Good afternoon, Dad." Charles took a step back. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He blinked, as if to be sure he wasn't dreaming. He looked at Grace. He called me Dad." She nodded. "Yes," in German. He looked again at the room. The whiteboard, the cards, the colorful books with hand-drawn stars and hearts. A setup far more meaningful than any therapy session money had ever bought him. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice lower now. Grace answered softly. "A little over a month. It started with a song, then a word, then more." Charles struggled to respond. "Why didn't you tell me?" She hesitated, not out of fear, but because she knew her answer would land harder than he expected. "Because you never asked." The silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken. Charles looked at his son, at the small boy who had once felt unreachable, who now looked him in the eye. He crouched down, slowly, almost clumsily, to Noah's level. You can really talk?" Noah nodded. Then, in the softest voice, in perfect English, he said, "Grace taught me." It was the first time Charles had ever heard his son say someone's name, and the way he said it, with reverence, with trust, was like a knife. He stood back up, eyes glassy, and looked at her. "I didn't know who you were." Grace held his gaze, then spoke with calm finality. "Neither did I, until he reminded me." No more words were needed. The room said it all. A boy who spoke 9 languages, a woman who thought she had nothing left to offer, and a father, finally listening. Charles didn't say thank you, didn't apologize, he just stood there. For once, not as the CEO of an empire, but as a man trying to remember how to be a father. And as he turned to leave, he looked back one last time. Noah was holding Grace's hand, and in that moment, everything Charles had missed became painfully, beautifully clear. Charles Montgomery was a man used to making decisions quickly. He had built empires with confidence, signed million-dollar contracts in minutes. But this was different. He didn't rush. In the days after he walked in on Grace and Noah in the library, he watched, quietly. He lingered near doorways, sat through dinners in silence, paid attention to the way Noah moved now, his shoulders no longer tense, his eyes no longer searching the floor. He heard laughter where once there had only been silence. He found flashcards tucked into corners, notebooks filled with drawings and multilingual scribbles, little signs of a world opening up. And always, at the center of it, was Grace. Not just cleaning anymore, not just assisting, teaching, not with formality, but with presence. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows, he asked her to join him for coffee. She arrived cautiously, still in uniform, a damp cleaning rag in her hands. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." She hesitated, then obeyed. Hands folded, eyes calm. He looked down at his cup, took a breath. "I spoke with the school directors," he began. "They're amazed. Noah's progress is beyond anything they've seen." Grace said nothing. She had never needed to fill silence with words. Charles stirred his coffee absently. "They think we've enrolled him in some elite program. They think we've found some revolutionary method." Grace offered a faint smile. "Have we?" he asked, glancing at her. She looked up. "We just listened." That landed heavier than he expected. He nodded slowly, like someone realizing something too late. "This house," he said, scanning the empty space around them. "It's full of everything. Except what matters." He placed it on the table. A formal offer, letterhead, signature space at the bottom. "I don't want you to be the janitor anymore," he said. That never made sense. She looked at the envelope, didn't touch it. "I want you to be Noah's full-time tutor, with everything you need. Books, space, support." Her eyes didn't flicker, but her fingers gently grazed the paper's edge. He leaned forward. "What you've done here doesn't have a title, but it deserves one." Grace paused. Then, with a voice both steady and soft, she answered, "I'll accept, on one condition." He raised his brow. "Go on." "That I don't have to hide who I am anymore. No uniforms, no silence when I have something to say. And Noah, he must be seen as a whole child, not a miracle, not a case study, just a boy who wants to grow in peace." Charles nodded. A long pause. Then, "That's more than fair." And it was. Because in a house built to be untouchable, she had touched something no one else could, and she had done it without asking for permission. That night, Grace removed her janitor's uniform for the last time. She folded it slowly, washed her hands, tied her hair differently, not because she was trying to look like someone else, but because for the first time in years, she was stepping back into who she truly was. The next morning, Noah met her at the door with a grin. He ran ahead to what had once been the old office, now transformed into a small study room. On the whiteboard were 9 words. Each one said the same thing. "Welcome, teacher." He turned to her, eyes shining. "It's official now, right?" Grace knelt down, eyes misty. "Now, it's our beginning." The house hadn't changed. The walls were still tall, the windows still grand, but something within them had shifted. The silence was no longer heavy. It had become space. Space for laughter, for learning, for healing. Grace was no longer the woman who cleaned the mansion. She was the one who gave it a soul. Some stories are born in silence. They grow in whispers, in hidden rooms, in quiet gestures no one sees. But eventually, some stories ask to be told. It had been a few months since Grace became Noah's official tutor. The mansion was different now, not because of what had changed on the outside, but because of what had awakened within. Noah wasn't just learning, he was thriving. He filled the halls with phrases in different languages. He left sticky notes in Spanish for the gardener, spoke Arabic with the housekeeper, practiced Italian with the cook. He taught, he laughed, he belonged. Charles saw it all. And for once in his life, he didn't rush to turn it into a headline or a photo op, but others noticed. One of the directors of the Montgomery Foundation, which supported educational initiatives, visited the mansion. She stayed for 15 minutes and left speechless. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived. It was for the inauguration of a new educational wing in the Foundation's name, dedicated to children with speech and developmental challenges. Noah was to be one of the first to benefit from its programs, and more than that, he was invited to speak, publicly, on stage. The idea terrified Grace, not because she didn't believe in him, but because she knew what it meant. To speak after silence is to bleed in front of an audience. But Noah, he wasn't afraid. "I want to tell them," he said. "I want people to know." And Grace understood. This wasn't about performance. This was about truth. The day of the event arrived. The venue was a restored theater in downtown Manhattan. Seats filled with educators, philanthropists, journalists, some of whom had known Charles Montgomery as nothing more than a name in Forbes. Now, they were about to meet his son, and the woman who had changed everything. The lights dimmed. A spotlight rose. Noah stepped onto the stage, holding a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled slightly, but his eyes, they were steady. He spoke. "Good evening. My name is Noah Montgomery. For a long time, I didn't speak. Not because I couldn't, but because I didn't know how to be heard." He paused. The crowd was silent. Even the breathing felt quiet. People tried to fix me, gave me books, toys, therapy, but no one saw me. He turned to look at Grace seated in the front row, until she did. One day a woman walked into our house with a cleaning cart and a song. She didn't ask me to speak. She just spoke to me, and when I was ready, I answered. Today, I speak 9 languages, but more important than that, I speak to myself, and I listen. He unfolded the final part of the paper. "Miss Grace, you taught me more than words. You taught me that even silence can be heard, if someone is willing to listen." He stepped back. The theater stood in unison. Grace didn't clap, not right away. She cried, openly, not tears of sadness, but of recognition, because what Noah had just said, that was her voice too, spoken through his. Charles took the stage next. He looked at the crowd, then at his son, then at Grace. His voice cracked. "I spent my life building things, buildings, businesses, foundations, but I failed to build something right in front of me, a bridge to my son. I thought I needed experts. What I really needed was someone who cared." He turned to Grace. "She walked into my house as a janitor and left as the person who gave my son back to me. If anyone still thinks she was just a cleaner, then maybe it's time we redefine what it means to clean. Because she didn't polish furniture, she uncovered a soul." Another wave of applause. Journalists approached Grace after the event. One leaned in with a recorder. "Ms. Miller, what do you think made the difference in Noah's recovery?" She smiled gently. "I didn't change anything, I just showed up. I listened. Sometimes that's enough." That night, they didn't drive home in silence. Noah sat in the back seat, humming softly. Grace sat beside him, holding the speech he had left behind on the chair. Charles, for once, took the long way home, because sometimes, when you finally start hearing the things that matter, you don't want the moment to end too soon. And in the quiet that followed, no one needed to speak, because this time everyone was listening. The mansion on the hill hadn't changed. Its walls were still tall, its gates still heavy, its rooms still filled with art, marble, and wealth. But inside, something was different. There was laughter now, real, unforced, and often in more than one language. There were notes stuck to the refrigerator in French, drawings of food labeled in Spanish on the kitchen table, sticky notes with Arabic greetings on the hallway mirror. There was life. Noah ran through the corridors with open books in his arms, reciting German idioms like they were spells, teaching Italian to the cook, and inventing new words just for fun. He didn't hide anymore. He took up space, he had opinions, he had voice. Grace still walked the same halls, still moved with calm, still noticed what others didn't. But now, she wore no uniform. She carried no rag, no mop. Only books and sometimes a notebook of her own. She wasn't just the tutor, she was Grace Miller again. The woman she had been before the fire, before the grief, before the silence. Only now, she was stronger, softer, more human. She hadn't returned to who she was. She had grown into who ella precisava si tornar. Charles Montgomery, too, had changed. He started working from home more often, not to supervise, but to observe. He began reading the cards Noah left around the house, sat in on their sessions, asked questions. He didn't try to control anymore, he just showed up. And for a boy who had once stopped speaking, that meant everything. Their dinners weren't about presentation anymore. They were about conversation, sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish, sometimes in complete silence. But it was a silence that breathed, a silence full of presence. People think healing comes like lightning, fast, loud, blinding. But sometimes healing comes like a whisper. One word, one smile, one gentle hand reaching through the dark and saying, "I see you." Grace never asked to be recognized. She never wanted applause. She only wanted to help one child find his way back to the world. And in doing that, she found her way back to herself. Some stories don't need grand endings. They just need to be lived, fully, quietly, and with love. Because in the end, it wasn't about 9 languages. It wasn't about speeches or ceremonies. It was about the courage to listen, the power of presence, and the silent, unstoppable strength of being seen. If this story touched your heart the way Grace touched Noah's, remember, sometimes all a child, all a person needs, is someone who chooses to stay.